It's my pleasure and privilege today to tell you the amazing story of Jan Mashiani and Len Taunyane, who were Africa's first Black Olympians. And right at the beginning of this presentation, there are some people that I need to thank and to whom credit must be given. First and foremost of these is Professor Floris van der Merwe of the University of Stellenbosch. It was Prof. van der Merwe's original research that first brought this astonishing story to light. The details of it can be found in his book, The Boer War Show of St. Louis, 1904. And then also credit to Prof. Frans-Jan Pretorius for his detailed research on the role of Agterryers during the South African War. And then two journalists, Sean O'Toole and Corin Abbott, who publicized the research that had been done by Prof. van der Merwe. And lastly, to Vincent Carruthers, who in fact prepared the original PowerPoint presentation, of which my presentation today is an adaptation. Okay, so the South African War, also known as the Second Anglo-Boer War, very familiar to all of you. But what we really want to focus on this morning is the fact that there were many Black South Africans involved in the South African War on both sides of the conflict. And certainly both the British and the Boers used non-combatant black labor and messengers. They served as cooks, as sappers, as drivers, as signalers. But more than that, by the end of the war, there were more than 30,000 armed black soldiers fighting on the British side, mostly as blockhouse guards and scouts. On the Boer side, there was insignificant involvement by men who were known as Agterryers, about 12,000 of them. Agterryer, we could translate it literalistically as something like after rider, but that really doesn't tell us what they did. Dr. Garth Bennyworth has pointed out that really the best way to translate Agterryer is military auxiliary. They played a vitally important support role to the Boer forces. They looked after the horses, which was an extremely important aspect of the Boers' armed response to the British, the mobility that horses gave them. Often the Agterryer would ride or lead a second horse. He would carry extra ammunition with him. The Agterryers also made the fires, they cooked the food, they performed many other services for the Boer forces, and in this way played a vital role. Here's a lovely example. This photograph of Commandant Louis Wessels of President Stein's bodyguard with his Agterryer, with a companion. The photo has been wonderfully colorized by Jennifer Bosch, and we thank her for that. And certainly the Agterryer was the one who had made the fire, who'd cooked the food, and now here he is enjoying a meal with Commandant Wessels and his companion. Now, for many years, the role of Agterryers was severely neglected. But then in 2013, Toki Pretorius commissioned Phil Minnar to sculpt a memorial for the Agterryer, for the Anglo-Boer War Museum in Bloemfontein. And here we see this wonderful memorial. And it was the very first time that Agterryers had in fact been honored with a memorial. Back to the events of the South African War, really very briefly. Initially, things went well for the Boers and went badly for the British. But then the older Boer generals made a serious error. They allowed their forces to be bogged down in the sieges of Mafeking and Kimberley and Ladysmith. And by February 1900, the tide had already begun to turn in favor of the British, most particularly with the advance of Field Marshal Lord Roberts up to the Orange Free State with his army of 40,000 men and 100 guns. And on the 18th of February 1900, Assistant Commandant General Piet Cronje and his force of 4,000 Boers were surrounded by the British at Paardeberg in the Western Free State. There was a general Boer retreat, but General Cronje and his men were trapped there at Paardeberg. And for 9 days, they were subjected to an intense artillery bombardment by the British. And finally, on the 27th of February, 1900, General Piet Cronje, with his 4,000 men and with their Agterryers, were surrendered to the British. And two of those Agterryers were the Tswana men, Jan Mashiani and Len Taunyane. And Dr. Garth Bennyworth very kindly shared with me this historic photograph that shows some of General Cronje's men immediately after the surrender. And I want us to focus on the person who is towards the right of the photo, crouching down. If I zoom in, you can see him. He is definitely an Agterryer. And we think this might, in fact, be Len Taunyane. We obviously cannot be 100% sure, but it is a remarkable photo. And it shows here an Agterryer along with these Boers at the moment of surrender. General Cronje was with his men and with the Agterryers was sent off to a British prisoner of war camp on the island of St. Helena. General and Mrs. Cronje, she accompanied him, lived in relative comfort in quite a large house on the island of St. Helena, which you see there. There they are sitting on the veranda. We also have this very interesting photograph showing General and Mrs. Cronje, the British soldiers behind them, the soldiers assigned to guard them. But there, sitting on the right, is Len Taunyane, one of the Agterryers. He seems to have been one of the personal attendants of General Cronje. It was certainly very close to him. We unfortunately don't know the identity of the youngster who's sitting in front of the General and Mrs. Cronje, but he possibly also had played a role as an Agterryer. The Agterryers did not live nearly as comfortably on St. Helena as General Cronje and his wife. They were in the main prison of war camp. Here we have a photograph of a group of them who are busy cleaning the camp. And once again, here we have Len Taunyane. Now, the South African War finally ended on the 31st of May, 1902, and General Cronje and his men and the Agterryers returned to the Transvaal. And at that point, Len Taunyane and Jan Mashiani disappear from view. And then, lo and behold, they surface again in 1904, and of all places, they surface in the city of St. Louis, in the state of Missouri, in the United States of America. So, of course, we have to ask the question, what were Jan Mashiani and Len Taunyane doing in St. Louis, Missouri in 1904? There's a wonderful photograph, then again beautifully colorized by Jennifer Bosch, of Jan Mashiani and Len Taunyane ready to run in the 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis. And in order to understand how they came to be there, we need to look at three seemingly unrelated strands of history and how these came together to place these two men there at the Olympic Marathon. And the first strand, believe it or not, is the Napoleonic Wars that were fought in Europe in the early 1800s. The second strand is the South African War. And the third strand is the development of the modern Olympic Games. And these three strands came together to make this remarkable event something that actually happened. Let's talk firstly about the Napoleonic Wars, and as our way of entry into that, we will ask the question: what was this exhibition in St. Louis in 1904? And in order to understand that, we start with two very famous men. the French Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the president of the USA in the early 1800s. And what had happened is that during the 18th century, the French had claimed for themselves a very large chunk of the North American continent. And there you see the extent of it, what was known as the Louisiana Territory. And it was 4 times the size of France. It was 2 million square kilometers. But in the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte was embroiled in a war with Great Britain. And he really needed to focus on what was happening in Europe, and he wanted to dispose of this American territory. So he entered into negotiations with Thomas Jefferson, and it was agreed that the American government would buy the Louisiana Territory for $15 million US dollars, which sounds like a lot of money, but it worked out to exactly 3 American cents per acre. And this was known as the Louisiana Purchase, and the whole deal was finalized in 1804. 100 years later, just to give you an idea, there were in 1904 45 American states, and what had been the Louisiana Territory made up all or part of no less than 15 of those American states. So this was a really big deal. And it was decided 1904, it's the centenary of the Louisiana Purchase. We must have a huge event to celebrate that centenary. And so was planned the World Fair at St. Louis in Missouri. And it was to open on the 30th of April 1904 and run all the way through until the beginning of December of that year. And I want to give you an idea of just how big this St. Louis World Fair was. The site that it occupied was 1,200 acres in size. There were 1,500 buildings connected by about 120 kilometers of roads and pathways. There were exhibits by the American government, by 43 of the American states, and more than 50 other countries. And there were also dozens of other stands providing amusements of various kinds. And in total, more than 19 million people attended the St. Louis World Fair. Just to say you some photographs to bring home the grand scale of this World Fair. Here are some of the buildings under construction. There you see the grand interior of one of these buildings. And then this view showing the man-made river that ran through the fairground, again with these amazing and majestic buildings. So that was the St. Louis World Fair. But then there was a man by the name of Captain Arthur Waldo Lewis. He was a resident of St. Louis, Missouri, but he had fought for the British during the South African War. And he had the idea of presenting reenactments of South African war battles during the World Fair. And he made contact with a South African circus impresario by the name of Frank Phillis. You see his photograph there on the right of the slide. And Frank Phillis took on the task of recruiting hundreds of men who had fought on both sides during the South African War and who were willing to travel to the USA and take part in battle reenactments. And Frank Phillis had no difficulty in finding all of the men that he needed to do this. The battles to be reenacted in the USA included the battles of Colenso and Paardeberg. And those recruited to perform included Assistant Commandant General Piet Cronje. We see him there again in the middle of the slide. And of course, he had surrendered at Paardeberg. And they also included Combat General Ben Viljoen, who had been present at the Battle of Colenso. And very importantly for our story, General Cronje brought with him to the USA his 2 Agterryers, Len Taunyane and Jan Mashiani. Along with the other men who had been recruited, they left Cape Town by ship on the 12th of March, 1904. And they came up with a very grand name for their reenactments. It was called the Anglo-Boer War Historical Libretto. And there you see a copy of the official program. And this was to be held in an amphitheater which could seat 25,000 people. The amphitheater contained a man-made river, a Boer lager, British military camp, and an African village, as they called it, with black people in traditional clothing, as well as thousands of items like weapons, mats, karosses, eating utensils, which portrayed daily life in African communities. And it's very likely that Taunyane and Jan Mashiani, these two Tswana Agterryers, also participated in the African village display, as well as the Boer War reenactments. Now, on the 16th of June 1904, 600 veterans of the South African War, including the Agterryers, paraded along a 16-kilometer route through the streets of St. Louis. The next day saw the first performance of reenactments in the amphitheater, which was full to capacity. In addition to the 25,000 people who attended, the organizers had to turn away an additional 10,000 people who could not be accommodated. The program was truly spectacular. The portrayals of the battles of Colenso and Paardeberg included much firing of ammunition from rifles and cannons, as well as a Boer ammunition wagon exploding, as it happened at Paardeberg. There was also a scene portraying General Christian de Wet escaping from the British. At the climactic moment, one of the Boers jumped with his horse 10 meters down into the man-made river, which had been constructed in the amphitheater. It was a daring stunt which had never previously been performed in the USA. Not surprisingly, the Anglo-Boer War historical libretto received overwhelmingly positive reviews from the general public. Now, as I've mentioned, the Agterryers' involvement in St. Louis extended to more than just the South African War reenactments. Some of the exhibits at the World Fair, in fact, had strong racist overtones and were designed with the intention of proving the superiority of white people over black people. As previously mentioned, these exhibits included an African village in which the black men brought from South Africa participated. They also included the so-called anthropology days, which featured sports events for the black people appearing in the fair's ethnic displays. And these events were held with the express purpose of comparing the physical prowess of so-called savages against so-called civilized men. Bizarrely, the events included a mud-throwing fight and tree climbing. But there were also athletic events, including a 1-mile race. And it was in this event that the athletic prowess of Taunyane and Jan Mashiani was first noticed. Taunyane led for most of the way, and he finished the race in 3rd position. Now, this brings us to the 3rd strand of history. You'll remember the 3, the Napoleonic Wars, the South African War, and now, thirdly, the establishment of the modern Olympic Games, and the games which were held in St. Louis during the 1904 World Fair. The International Olympic Committee was established in 1894 by the French educator and historian Baron Pierre de Coubertin. The first modern games were held in Athens in 1896 and the second in Paris in 1900. The International Olympic Committee had originally decided that the 1904 Olympics would be held in Chicago, but they were eventually persuaded that the Games should instead be held in St. Louis in conjunction with the World Fair. And there we see a poster for those Olympic Games in 1904. Now, based on their performance in the Anthropology Day 1-mile race, Jan Mashiani and then Taunyane were invited to take part in the 1904 Olympic Marathon, which was held on the 30th of August, 1904. Now, there was also a third South African, Bertie Harris, from Aliwal North in the Cape Colony, and he also entered the race. The marathon, a race of more than 40 kilometers, was run in extremely hot and dusty conditions. Just to show you the start, and we think we can see one of our Agterryers standing there amidst the crowd. And then this photo shows the actual moment when the starting gun was fired and the men started on the race. So as I say, it was a 40-kilometer race, and it was extremely hot and dusty. The course ran over the streets of St. Louis, which were at the same time being used by large numbers of horse-drawn carriages and motor cars. One official described the course as the most difficult a human being was ever asked to run over. Some of the roads were literally inches deep in dust. Others were strewn with loose stones, which made running extremely difficult. And have another look when we come back to the photograph of the two Agterryers, and you'll see that Taunyane ran barefoot. There were 7 hills on the course, some with long, unrelenting ascents, and only 2 places where the athletes could obtain drinking water. Bertie Harris dropped out of the race shortly after halfway, but the two Agterryers resolutely kept on running. During the South African War, they had often run cross-country over long distances with important messages from General Cronje to other Boer military leaders. The marathon was thus a race to which they were ideally suited. Now, Vincent Carruthers has put together this very interesting graph showing the position of the 3 South African at various stages of the race. And you'll see there, 15 miles, Bertie Harris dropped out. But you can also see that something strange happened with Jan Mashiani. After 5 miles, he was 14th, but suddenly at 10 miles, he had dropped way back to 23rd position. And then for the rest of the race, his position steadily improved. What was going on there? Well, the fact of the matter was that in addition to the heat and the dust, there were also other hazards to face during the race. And Jan Mashiani was in fact chased off the course by a vicious dog, believe it or not. And this certainly affected his finishing time. But the Agterryers were also placed at a significant disadvantage due to the behavior of some of the other runners. An American, Fred Lortz, was initially declared the winner of the race, but it was then discovered that he had in fact cheated. And he didn't cheat just a little bit. He was given a lift in a car for 18 kilometers. Fortunately, this was discovered just as Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, was about to lower the golden medal around his neck. Another American, Thomas Hicks, was then declared the winner. And there we see an exhausted Thomas Hicks being helped along the course by 2 of his trainers. But Thomas Hicks had in fact only managed to win the race after being repeatedly given brandy, egg white, and a very powerful poison called strychnine, which in small doses is used as a stimulant. It was the first recorded instance of drug use by a competitor in the modern Olympics. However, there were at this time no rules against the use of such substances by Olympic athletes. Hicks was in fact carried by his trainers over the finish line, who held him up while he feebly moved his feet backwards and forwards. Hicks commented afterwards, "Never in my life have I run such a tough course. The terrific hills simply tear a man to pieces." And there we see Thomas Hicks with some of his friends shortly after the race had finished. Nobody looks very happy. But in contrast to Hicks and some of the other athletes, Taunyane and Jan Mashiani were still in good physical condition at the end of the race, with Taunyane finishing in 9th position and Mashiani finishing 12th. And there we see Jan Mashiani running strongly, approaching the finish line. Now, Vincent Carruthers has drawn an intriguing connection between Jan Mashiani and Taunyane and the very first marathon, which was run way back in the year 490 BC. In that year, the Greek states were at war with the Persian Empire, and a large battle was fought at a place called Marathon, about 40 kilometers north of Athens. There was a Greek man by the name of Phidippides, and he was a military messenger, known in Greek as hemerodromos, which means literally a day runner. In other words, someone who can run all day long. And it is said that as the Greek army was gaining the upper hand over the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, Phidippides saw a Persian warship heading south towards Athens. He feared that the Persians, when reaching Athens, would falsely claim that the Persian army had defeated the Greeks. Phidippides thus ran 40 kilometers from Marathon to Athens and burst into the assembly of the Athenian leaders. He shouted, "Victory! Victory! We have won!" And then he dropped down dead. He thus foiled Persian plans to falsely claim victory in the battle. To commemorate his feat, the marathon race was included in the modern Olympics. Like Phidippides, the Agterryers Jan Mashiani and Len Taunyane were military messengers. Unlike him, however, they finished their marathon in good health, still running strongly. By doing so, they became Africa's first Black Olympians. I want to conclude my presentation this morning by telling you about the memorial to Africa's first Black Olympians at Kedar Heritage Lodge. And there you see a photograph of the memorial. Kedar Heritage Lodge was established by the late Robert Forsyth on the farm Buchenhoutfontein, north of Rustenburg. It was the country home of President Paul Kruger. And Kedar is home to one of the world's largest private South African war collections. It also has memorials to more than a dozen significant individuals from the South African War. It was Robert Forsyth's vision to erect a memorial to Jan Mashiani and Len Taunyane, these two Agterryers who completed the 1904 Olympic marathon and so became Africa's first Black Olympians. Robert's daughter Sarah made this vision a reality, and on the 17th of September 2022, the memorial was unveiled at Kedar Heritage Lodge. These beautiful statues were crafted by master sculptor Adam Madebe. Then next to the memorial, there are information panels which tell the remarkable story of these two men. It is indeed a fitting tribute. We unfortunately know nothing of the lives of these two men after the 1904 Olympic Games, but we rightly celebrate the remarkable achievement of Jan Mashiani and Len Taunyane, Africa's first Black Olympians. Thank you very much.